He did not cry when they fired him, not in the office, not in front of the glass walls and the polished desks, not even when the security guard stood too close like he might steal something. He just nodded quietly, held the cardboard box tighter in his arms, and walked out with his head down, because when you are a single father, you learn early that tears are a luxury you cannot afford. His name was Daniel, and until that morning, he had been invisible, the kind of employee who arrived early, stayed late, fixed problems nobody wanted to touch, and went home before anyone noticed he was gone. He had never asked for favors, never complained, never reminded them that he had a child waiting at home with asthma and school shoes that were already too small. He simply worked, and believed that hard work was protection enough. But protection disappeared the moment the CEO decided he was no longer useful. The CEO was a woman named Veronica Hale, a self-made millionaire, admired in magazines, feared in boardrooms, praised for being ruthless, efficient, and untouchable. She did not raise her voice when she fired him, she did not insult him directly, she just smiled politely and said the company was restructuring, and that his position was no longer needed, and that he should be grateful for the experience. Daniel wanted to speak, wanted to explain that the project she was praising last week had been saved by his overnight fixes, that the trucks outside ran on systems he personally repaired, but his throat locked, and years of swallowing injustice trained him to stay silent. He walked past coworkers who suddenly found the floor very interesting, past managers who avoided eye contact, past the parking lot where his old red car waited like a tired friend, and that was when he heard her voice calling his name from behind, sharp and irritated, like the world still owed her obedience. He did not turn around at first, because he had nothing left to give, but she kept calling, and finally he stopped, slowly, carefully, like someone afraid the ground might collapse beneath him. Veronica stood several steps away, perfectly dressed, heels clicking against concrete, one hand raised as if stopping traffic, her face annoyed rather than concerned, and she told him he had forgotten to sign an exit document. He placed the box on the hood of his car, signed the paper without reading it, handed it back, and said thank you, because politeness had become a shield, even when dignity was already bruised. She nodded, satisfied, turned away, and walked back toward power without a second glance. Daniel sat in his car for a long time after that, hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly, counting each breath, because panic was loud and he needed silence to survive it. His phone buzzed, and for a brief moment he hoped it was a mistake, a call telling him to come back, but it was his daughter Lily, asking if he would be home early today, her voice small and hopeful, and he said yes, because lies told with love sometimes feel like mercy. The drive home felt longer than usual, every traffic light a reminder that time was moving and money was not, and when he reached their small apartment, Lily ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek against his chest, and that was when his strength cracked just enough to let the sadness settle deeper. That night, after she fell asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with unpaid bills, his laptop open, scrolling through job listings that demanded more hours for less pay, his resume feeling smaller with every rejection he imagined, and still, somewhere under the weight, a quiet hope refused to die. He applied anyway, patiently, carefully, tailoring each application, fixing his resume the same way he fixed broken systems, methodically, without drama. Days passed, then weeks, and savings thinned like breath in cold air. Lily's inhaler ran low, and Daniel took on night shifts repairing machinery at a warehouse, working until his hands shook, sleeping in short fragments, never telling her how tired he was, because children hear fear even when it is whispered. Meanwhile, Veronica's company began to stumble, quietly at first, then louder. Systems failed. Trucks stopped mid-route. Contracts were delayed. Meetings stretched longer with fewer answers. Engineers blamed each other. Managers demanded reports that made no sense. Veronica grew impatient, then angry, then suspicious. She demanded to know who had designed the old infrastructure, who understood the legacy systems no one wanted to touch, and names were mentioned, half remembered, until one assistant hesitated and finally said Daniel's name. Veronica laughed at first, dismissive, saying no single employee mattered, but when another failure hit, and another, and clients began calling directly, threatening to pull millions, the laughter stopped. She ordered files reviewed, logs checked, and slowly, uncomfortably, the truth surfaced. Daniel had been the quiet backbone. The one who fixed what others broke. The one who stayed invisible so the company could shine. The realization did not come with guilt at first, only with fear, because power does not regret, it calculates. Veronica told herself rehiring him would be simple, a phone call, a salary offer, a signature. But when her assistant finally reached him, Daniel listened calmly, thanked her for calling, and said he was no longer available, because sometimes the smallest word, spoken softly, carries the heaviest weight. Veronica felt something unfamiliar then, not anger, not control, but resistance, and for the first time in years, she realized the ground beneath her was not as solid as she believed. After Daniel declined the call, life did not suddenly become easier for him, it became quieter, heavier, and more demanding, because refusing power does not magically create comfort, it only preserves dignity. He woke before sunrise every day, made Lily breakfast, checked her breathing, walked her to school, then went to the warehouse where machines screamed louder than his thoughts, where grease stained his hands and exhaustion lived permanently in his bones. He worked without complaint, because work, even hard work, felt honest, unlike the silence that followed injustice. At night, he studied system manuals he no longer needed, not because he planned to return, but because understanding had always been his way of staying calm. Meanwhile, Veronica's world grew louder and more desperate. Board members questioned her decisions. Investors demanded explanations. Contracts were frozen. Each failure traced back to a system nobody could stabilize. Consultants were hired, expensive ones, confident ones, and they all said the same thing in different words, that whoever built this architecture understood it in a way documents never could. Veronica listened, jaw tight, nails pressed into her palm, because the name Daniel kept resurfacing like an accusation. She ordered another call, this time offering more money, a title, a public apology disguised as an opportunity. Daniel listened again, quietly, respectfully, then declined again, not out of anger, but because his patience had limits and he had already paid the price for believing loyalty was mutual. That refusal unsettled her more than any failure report, because money usually worked, titles usually worked, fear usually worked, and this man responded to none of it. Days later, Lily had an asthma attack at school. Daniel rushed her to the clinic, heart pounding, mind racing, calculating costs before the doctor even spoke. He paid with the last of his savings, smiling at Lily so she would not feel the fear he swallowed. That night, after she slept, he sat in the dark, feeling helplessness settle in his chest, heavy and cold, wondering how long patience could last before hope finally broke. At the same time, Veronica stood in a glass-walled conference room, surrounded by executives who no longer hid their doubt. One contract was officially cancelled. Millions were lost. The board demanded a solution within days. For the first time in her career, she felt cornered. Not attacked, not defeated, but limited. And limits terrified her. She dismissed everyone, stayed alone, and stared at the city lights below, realizing that power built on control collapses the moment control disappears. She remembered Daniel's eyes the day she fired him, not angry, not pleading, just tired, and something uncomfortable shifted inside her, something close to recognition. The next morning, she did not send an assistant. She went herself. She stood outside the warehouse, expensive car out of place among delivery trucks, waiting, watching Daniel emerge after a long shift, shoulders tense, face drawn. She called his name, softer this time. He stopped, turned slowly, guarded but calm. She did not speak immediately. Silence stretched, unfamiliar and humbling. Then she said she was wrong. Not strategically wrong, not financially wrong, but personally wrong. The words tasted strange, but she said them anyway. She told him the company was failing without him, that she needed him back, that she would do whatever it took. Daniel listened without interruption, boxy warehouse lights flickering behind him, his hands still smelling of oil and metal. He thought of Lily, of nights without sleep, of the way his voice had shaken when he told her everything would be fine. He felt sadness still there, helplessness still close, but beneath it, a quiet hope stirred, cautious, restrained. He told Veronica he would think about it, not because he trusted her, but because patience had taught him that rushed decisions often favor the powerful. Veronica nodded, relieved and uneasy at the same time, realizing she was no longer dictating terms. As she walked back to her car, she understood something else too, that this was not a negotiation she could win with authority alone, and for the first time, she felt the weight of asking instead of commanding. Daniel did not give her an answer that day, or the next, because patience was the only leverage he had ever truly owned, and he was not about to spend it carelessly. He went home, cooked dinner, helped Lily with homework, listened to her breathe as she slept, and let the quiet stretch, because quiet had become a place where he could finally hear himself think. Veronica waited, checking her phone more than she would ever admit, pretending calm in meetings while deadlines closed in like walls. The board demanded updates. Investors wanted names. She gave them time, bought days with excuses, knowing each one cost her credibility. Daniel, meanwhile, met with a small local firm that offered stability but little growth, honest pay but no future security, and he felt the familiar pull between safety now and dignity later. Lily asked why he looked tired even when he smiled, and he told her some problems take time to solve, and she nodded like she understood more than he expected. When Veronica called again, her voice was different, stripped of polish, almost fragile. She did not mention money first this time. She asked how his daughter was. Daniel paused, surprised by the question, then answered truthfully. She listened. That silence mattered more than any offer. She asked to meet, not at the office, but somewhere neutral, somewhere without glass walls or assistants. They met at a small cafe near the river. Veronica arrived early, no entourage, no power armor. Daniel arrived tired, cautious, carrying the weight of every decision he had ever postponed. She spoke plainly. She admitted she had built success by being untouchable, and that it had blinded her. She said the company needed him, but more than that, she said she needed to fix what she had broken. Daniel did not interrupt. He let her finish. Then he spoke, calmly, steadily, explaining what it felt like to be erased, to be treated as replaceable when he had given everything, to drive home wondering how to explain to a child that fairness does not always show up on time. He did not accuse. He did not raise his voice. That quiet honesty hit harder than anger ever could. Veronica listened, eyes lowered, hands still. When she finally asked what he wanted, truly wanted, he did not say money. He said respect. He said transparency. He said a contract that protected employees like him, parents like him, people who carried invisible responsibilities. He said he would return only if the company changed, not symbolically, but structurally. Veronica hesitated, because agreeing meant surrendering a kind of power she had never questioned. Then she nodded. Slowly. Decisively. She agreed to every condition, knowing the board would resist, knowing it would cost her authority, but also knowing that authority without justice had already cost her more. The board meeting was tense. Objections were raised. Threats were implied. Veronica stood firm, defending Daniel's terms, defending a future that did not rely on fear. When Daniel walked back into the building weeks later, there was no applause, no dramatic announcement, just a quiet shift in air. Systems stabilized. Processes improved. People noticed. Not because he demanded credit, but because things simply worked again. Lily's inhaler was replaced without worry. Bills stopped piling up. Daniel still arrived early and left quietly, but now, when he walked through the halls, people looked up. Veronica watched from her office, not with control, but with something closer to respect, understanding finally that strength is not proven by who you can discard, but by who you are willing to ask forgiveness from. And slowly, without speeches or headlines, justice took shape, not loud or sudden, but steady, earned, and real. By the time the changes fully took hold, the company no longer felt like the same place, not because it was softer, but because it was fairer, and fairness has a quiet strength that fear can never imitate. Daniel never became loud, never chased recognition, he simply did what he had always done, fixed what was broken, protected what mattered, and went home on time to read Lily bedtime stories without his mind racing over unpaid bills. Employees noticed that policies now made room for real lives, flexible hours, medical support, clear accountability, and trust, and they understood, even if nobody said it out loud, that this shift had a name attached to it. Veronica changed too, though not overnight, because people built on power do not transform easily. She listened more. She interrupted less. She learned the difference between control and leadership the hard way, by almost losing everything that made her successful. One afternoon, months later, she called Daniel into her office, not to correct him, not to demand anything, but to tell him the board had approved a new foundation funded by her personal wealth, focused on supporting single parents and overlooked workers in technical fields. She did not ask for praise. She did not ask for forgiveness. She simply said his patience had forced her to see what money never showed her. Daniel thanked her, quietly, because gratitude did not mean forgetting, it meant choosing to move forward without bitterness. That evening, he stood on the balcony of their small apartment, city lights blinking like distant promises, Lily leaning against his side, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time, not victory, not revenge, but peace. He had been sad, then helpless, then quietly hopeful, patient when patience hurt, and justice had arrived not as a dramatic moment, but as a life slowly stitched back together with dignity and tact. Somewhere across the city, Veronica sat alone in her office, looking out at the same lights, understanding that asking a man she once dismissed to return had changed her far more than it had changed him. And in that shared silence, justice settled, not loudly, not perfectly, but honestly, exactly where it belonged.